Thank you for joining me for another episode of Build Your Poetry Manuscript with KMA. I am KMA Sullivan, founder and publisher at Yes Yes Books. I'm sorry I didn't put this video out yesterday. The holidays got the better of me, but here we are on a Saturday. So I hope you'll enjoy what we've got going on. And the topic of the 6th episode is let's talk about commas. So the first thing and most important thing to know about commas in poetry is that you are entirely in charge. And you need to be in charge of every single comma. There are 3 basic areas that I want to cover. First is know the rules. Second is know the tone. And third is know the power of a comma and the power of its absence. I think a lot of people are overwhelmed by how many rules apply to comma usage. But when it comes to writing poetry, honestly, there are really only 3 rules that you need to be aware of. The first one is introductory clauses, the use of a comma after an introductory clause. So, after the picnic, comma, we went to the museum. The second rule is how commas function in a list, which is, I think, self-explanatory, with the one exception that there's a lot of energetic conversation about the Oxford comma. The Oxford comma is diminishing in importance, even in standard prose, and honestly, we don't need to worry about it. The third comma rule has to do with the way a comma is used before a conjunction that joins 2 independent clauses. I went to the picnic and then I went to the museum. So it would be I went to the picnic, comma, and then I went to the museum. The other thing we need to know about commas is tone. So let's take the first rule, using the comma after an introductory clause, like after the picnic, comma, we went to the museum. That is absolutely formal comma usage. It's often not even used in standard prose, and in my opinion has no place at all in poetry unless you're doing something that involves formal comma usage for your own purposes. Sure, you can use it then, but otherwise it doesn't make any sense. The second rule of commas being used in a list, that is neutral, except for the Oxford comma, which is super formal, again, unless you are making a statement about formal grammar, formal punctuation in your poetry. That doesn't make any sense to have that last comma before the and, before the last item in the list. And the third rule that I mentioned, which is the use of a comma before a conjunction that joins 2 independent clauses, is also super formal. It is used in prose, but not always, formal prose, and again, has no place in poetry. I mean, that's my opinion, as always. Discard as you will. So here's the thing. You need to know what the rules are, more so because then you end up removing a lot of commas. If you understand that most commas are formal usage, then they probably need to go away. They certainly need to go away if you're doing anything even remotely experimental, but in general, commas do not need to be used according to the rules of grammar. Now, having said that, commas are exciting and they carry immense power. So when to use a comma? A lot of poets employ commas in order to encourage the reader's pause. That's a great reason. But I would ask you to consider, whenever possible, not ending a line with a comma if a pause is what you're after. Allow the line break to do its work. This is one of the great joys of poetry, figuring out where the line breaks need to go. And I would offer my opinion that commas at the end of a line actually do the opposite of what we think they're going to do. We might think that they're going to encourage even more of a pause. Though even there, we got to be real careful about not being pushy about what we want the reader to do. But I would say that actually the comma at a line break does the opposite, that it gives the reader an awareness that something comes next. There are a lot of reasons to remove commas at the end of the line. Not always. There are going to be moments where a comma at the end of the line makes sense, and you're going to have to feel your way through that. Another place commas can be very well used is when, if a line were in formal prose and a semicolon was called for. In poetry, often a comma can do that job. It always comes down to the question of what job is the comma doing? And they are powerful when used well. The other question to ask is, does a comma have to be there for this thing that I'm trying to do to happen? But there are definitely moments where if you ask yourself those questions, the answer is yes, the comma has a job. And yes, the comma is the thing that will do this job. Great. Then you got a spot for a comma. I have 3 levels of response to commas when I'm editing. The first is, let's talk about this comma. The second is, consider removing this comma. And the third is, this comma's got to go. The third I normally reserve for when a comma has been inserted according to formal comma usage, and that makes no sense within the context of the particular manuscript I'm reading. The let's talk about this comma is, I mean that honestly. There are going to be moments where I want to find out, to talk with the poet about what their intention is in that moment, what they're hoping the reader will do, and then we talk about whether the comma achieves that or not. But I will be honest that when I'm editing, I interrogate every single comma. And occasionally there's a moment that shows up where my note will be, consider adding a comma, and I just smile when I type that because it hardly ever happens. So where are places that commas can effectively show up? Certainly in lists, but again, I'd ask you to ask yourself, do you need the commas in those lists? And in poetry, it's so wonderful to have something that where the words simply flow. The word choice has been so accurate that punctuation is not necessary, that the word choice conveys the meaning. And that, after all, is why punctuation actually exists. Let's remember that. Punctuation doesn't exist because it's a platonic truth. It exists to help us communicate. And so in poetry, you're communicating in a very particular way. Compressed, fluid, multifaceted. So this is the essential reason why we get to do whatever we want regarding punctuation. As I've said before, I love that. So why am I talking about commas in a video series whose main goal is to help you get your manuscript to the top of a submission pile? That is my goal. And here's why. At Yes, we actually are very invested in the revision process. But a lot of presses are not. It is not because the editorial board doesn't care about revision. Not at all. People who are publishing poetry are doing it for love. That's the only reason any of us are here. But the time is so limited. The bodies are so limited. They're not available to commit the time to an extensive revision process. That's just one of those realities of getting a publication offer. An editor might see your manuscript and see a powerful heart and some spectacular and engaging language, but because of an inconsistency in punctuation usage, and what I mean by that is that the punctuation usage doesn't match the tone or the level of experimentation otherwise present in the manuscript. If that's not a match, there is going to be a sense that there is a lack of mastery. And therefore, that is going to lead an editorial crew to say, this manuscript is not ready. So that's why we're talking about this. Thank you for joining me for episode 6. Have a great rest of your day.